So, hey, welcome. And I'm so happy to be part of this event, worldwide event, SF24. This is so neat. So, it's really lovely to see many of you. Catherine, I see you. Hi. Hi there. And Hans, I see you too. Cool. So, well, the topic is an interesting one. I hope that you're intrigued by this topic. And the topic, I think, let me see. By the way, are you okay with the PowerPoints? And the reason why I have PowerPoint is because I speak English. I also speak a little bit of Korean. But if you were to, let's say, do presentation in Swedish, for example, then I would like to see some visuals. So in case you're not speaking English as your first language, I just wanted to have some PowerPoint. But then I went overboard. So I ended up like making 60 PowerPoints, but I'm not going to go over all of them, but hopefully it will be useful. So here's my PowerPoint. Hope you like it. And it's called Minding the F Words in Solution Focused Dialogue. And I really hope that you are imagining what that might be. So what do you think those F words might be? And as you think about it, you know, this actually came about because when I teach solution focused, oh, by the way, my name's Hae-sun Moon. I should actually introduce myself. Hae-sun Moon from Toronto. I live in Canada with my mom, 2 nephews, my dog. So that's how I can position myself. And I also work at the university. I teach solution focused dialogue, but my background, academic background, actually is in adult education. So that's the lens that I actually bring to solution focused dialogue. I see it as a way that we are, how humans learn. So that's my lens that I bring. And I think when I actually teach solution focused, I get asked a lot of times, what's the direction of this conversation? You know, where should we be? You know, in the beginning, what do we say? In the middle, what do we do? And how do we close the session? I don't know how many of you actually get asked that, but I do. So I thought about it. And today's presentation, I usually do presentation on the functions of what we do, but today will be about direction of what we do. So hopefully that's intriguing to some of you. Just a quick question. How many of you actually do solution focused stuff, whether it's in training, whatever, counseling, therapy, this and that? How many of you do something like that? Yes, yes. Okay, cool. And you might actually have a way to begin your session, right? Somehow you sort of begin your session by saying something. And I've seen, hey, I see all these thumbs ups in different colors. That's neat. And I've heard a lot of beginnings that, because, you know, when I was just learning, I'm like, oh, how do you even begin this thing? Like, what do you say? So I watched a lot of beginnings of how people actually open their session. And what do you usually say in your opening? So think about how you actually open your session. What do you actually say closer to the beginning of your session? What do you say? And I ask you that because when I do research, I love just browsing through YouTube. And if you actually put, let's say, coaching demo, I've watched it, okay? So I just simply YouTube and say coaching demo, and I just watch the videos. And it's really interesting because you get to see how other people do their work. Aisha says, it depends. So your opening seems to change all the time, depending on who's sitting in front of me, right? So for those of you who have some sort of more or less that opening, like, you know, there are some things that you actually say. And oftentimes I actually ask people, what else could you say instead of what you just wrote down? So for example, Paul, you wrote down, suppose this goes well, how would you like things to be different? What else might you say in your opening? And I can ask you this like 3 or 4 more times. But Paul, what else do you say?
Well, do you want me to answer?
Yes, please. I mean, you're here.
I am, yes. I sometimes ask, I mean, it does depend on context and who's in front of me. And I'm an improviser like Aisha, but it's usually something about what they would like to be different or better as a result of the conversation that we're going to have.
Right.
So I'm looking for some sort of change or improvement in, this might be a team, not just an individual, what they would like to have happening that's not happening at the moment that that they would be interested in working on.
Mm-hmm. I'm so glad that I asked you, Paul. Hey,
best hopes.
Best hopes, right?
So I think of it that the topic of the opening part of the conversation is, what do they want?
The topic
there are lots of questions that we can ask that
right.
address what do they want in various ways.
And it's so interesting because there's a reason why you open that way, because that's what you believe is useful. And we do that because we somehow believe that opening that way is useful. So I love watching how other people actually open their session. I mean, I just watched a session where this practitioner just opens with whole narrative about, introducing themselves and their background and so on, which is fine. Another one, their opening was simply with a hand gesture. And they said, so? And I'm like, what? And what? And then the client is like, oh, do you want me to kind of I don't know, tell you what's happening? And the practitioner said, sure. And that was the opening. And I'm thinking, what just happened? So when you actually watch those things, what do we actually have in mind when we open? So especially when I teach a class, that's something that we do right in the beginning, come up with 5 different openings. And how would you open? And then what else? And then what else? Because when we look at some of the openings, we find something very fascinating. So I'm going to give you some examples from our classic tapes. Is that okay if we actually do that? Are you okay with a PowerPoint? Yeah, okay. So example number 1, this person, one of the classic tapes that we actually have available at SFBTA. And the practitioner says this, I hope this coaching session will somehow turn out to be useful for you. In a minute, I'm going to ask you how it could turn out to useful, but beforehand, to give me an idea what you do, what kind of work you do, and how you spend your day might be helpful, just a tiny bit. So that was the opening. Isn't it interesting? So that's one example that is available through SFBTA as a demo tape. So then after the client says something, then this person says, okay, well, Jonathan, that's the client's name. I guess I'm wondering what would need to happen here in this coaching session today that would really be useful for you. So to go back home and say, well, this has been truly useful and helpful for me. Okay, so that's one of the examples that, it's available, actually, one of the demo tapes by Peter Szabo. And it's from the tape called Taken More Seriously. So that's one example. As you read this, I'm going to ask you to kind of watch for something that they do in common. Okay, so here's a second practitioner, a different person. And this person says, so what do you suppose I can do that will be helpful for you? Whose idea was it that you come here today? And the client says, it was my idea. And the practitioner says, your idea. Yeah, so how come? What made you think that you want to come and talk? So that's another tape. And who do you think this was, by the way? Just take a guess. For those of you who have watched some of these tapes, who does that sound like? Aisha.
Oh God, her name's left my head. Steve's partner. Insu.
Insu Kimberg. You're right. So this is from the tape, I Love My Kids. So this is how they sort of open in the beginning. And usually Insu does a little bit more of, how old are you? And all those different things in the beginning. But this is kind of like the opening that she does. Here's a last example that I want you to have a look at. And probably you might know, because this is a pretty well-known phrase, but this person says, well, first of all, I want to thank you for coming today, in a little grumpy tone. I hope it will be in some way useful. There's no guarantees about that. Yeah, but I can guarantee that I will do my best, and I assume you will too. We'll see what happens. So what do you tell me about how do you spend your days? what do you do with yourself all day? Who do you think this is? I mean, obviously, as you can tell, for those of you who are new to Solution Focus, by the way, hey, welcome. And these are some classic tapes that we have of Peter Szabo, Insoo Kim Berg, and this one by Steve DeShazer from the tape I Want to. So these are the 3 tapes that I wanted to show you a little bit more in detail. So now I'm going to ask you, what did you notice that's kind of like you see that's in common, and including what Paul said earlier as well? What did you notice in what Paul says, Peter says, Steve DeShazer, and Insoo? And that's the first F word, by the way. So when we look at some of these tapes, one of the very first things I noticed that people do very well actually is they ask right in the beginning about how they know that this was a good idea to come. So the first F word is the effect. Did you think it starts with an F, but it starts with an EF? So there you go. So the first word is effect. We notice that all these people, especially Paul, you're here. I'm so glad that you're here so we can interview you. But it's not about what we are going to do here so much, but it's about what would that do afterwards when you leave the room. So what will be the effect of us meeting together? Paul said earlier, as a result of meeting, what will be different? So it's not about what should we do together here, but as a result of whatever we do here, what would you like to see change or different? So the first little bit that people seem to do is they talk about the effect of us meeting here. So that's the first F word that I wanted to introduce to you. And something very interesting happens because when we are looking at what we mean by effect, I don't know how many of you are familiar with this very simple sort of, what do you call this? Quadrant, I guess. One of the things that I found it easier is to organize what our clients say on a very simple sort of map like this. So for those of you who may not know this, it's a very simple map. It's not about what you say, by the way, it's about what the clients say that we are mapping. And this map actually begins from left to right of that arrow. Horizontal arrow is something that our clients say that's actually in their past. So I'm going to actually annotate this. So right here, sorry, how many of you know this? And I'm repeating myself about what you already know. Sorry. Oh man, see, that's the thing. I'll be very quick for those of you who may not know. So here is something that happened in the past that our clients may tell us. And also they tell us something that might happen in the future. So that's a timeline of their narrative, isn't it? And then also if you listen carefully, they tell you something that they actually want to see increase in their life. And then also they tell you something that they're like, oh man, I so could do without that. So they want to see decrease. So when you put them together, you have kind of like roughly 4 different areas. Not that we can organize everything that they say onto these like 4 areas. But what's interesting is quadrant number 1 is something that they would like to see happen more in the future. That's what's called preferred future. I learned that preferred future term from Chris Iverson when he came to teach. And I love that term. It's preferred future. It's not perfect future, it's preferred. And second one is things that really happened in the past that you really liked, experiences. And they actually talk about it as if it was like, yeah, I did that. Yeah, I kind of liked it. And we call that a resourceful past. So quadrant 2 is resourceful past. Again, this is all based on what they say, not what I ask or what I say. This is 100% based on what the clients say. And then quadrant number 3 is things that happen in the past that they, didn't really enjoy. Sometimes it's as light as troubled past, or sometimes regretful past, or even deeper, it's traumatic past. So that's quadrant 3. Quadrant 4 is something that people talk about. They're like, oh man, I really, I'm dreading it. So it's dreaded future is quadrant 4. Hi, Eugenia, I see your face. Hi. You turned your video on. So hey, there you go. And there's Martin too. So quadrant 4 is dreaded or fearful future. So this is a kind of simple model that, I've been talking about for some time. And for some of you may not know this one. I hope you don't know this, but there's a little bracket of time because sometimes people say, what about now? So here's a little bracket of time that you and I are sitting together having this conversation. And this is just for the ease of it. This is the point zero. You and I are meeting together during this session, having this conversation. So the time practitioner and client sitting down together and having this conversation is point zero. So having said that, when we say effect, which quadrant do you think we're getting our clients to actually look at? That's our intended, what do you call it? Intended direction. So when we're asking in our opening, especially like how Paul did, Steve did, and all these people, you can actually see, that we are really trying to get to this quadrant one. So right here, it's not even about what should we do together during our session. It's not within the bracket. It's after you leave the room. When I am no longer in your life, how would you know the effect of having this conversation? That's what, right, Paul? It's not kind of like what you were getting at. So this is not during, but it's right after. And I remember a couple years ago, I think there was this like a very intriguing conversation about, is it best hopes for the conversation or from the conversation? It was so exciting. We're talking, and then we bring it to the client and they don't care. They just answer whatever. But that's a very useful distinction for us though. Is it best hopes for the conversation, from the conversation, however way our clients may answer it, our intended direction is, how would you know that things are different as a result of coming here? But you know what's interesting is they don't end there. Did you know? So when you look at some of these tapes, old tapes, I love it, because there are some things that people do that goes way beyond. But I actually pulled some very popular openings from just simply YouTubing. So I YouTubed, I Googled coaching demo tapes, and here are some openings that I actually found. So I'm gonna ask you to have a look at, and which one seems to be really getting to the effect of the conversation. First one is, what's most on your mind that would be useful to address? Interesting, huh? That's straight from the YouTube video. And it's not necessarily solution focused practice, okay? Number two, so tell me what's going on. It's another opening that I just got from just a coaching demo, and then this one showed up. Number three, what are you hoping to achieve? Now, this was a tricky one. And then number four, you must have a lot of thoughts. What's emerging for you? This is a very popular way of coaching these days. I don't know how to answer that. Number five, what brought you to this meeting? Number six, thank you for coming. How can I help you? Number seven, what would you like to talk about? Number eight, what might tell you that this meeting was a good idea? Now, out of all these, which ones are more like, you're really orienting to the effect of it? What do you think? Ah, interesting, eh? What are you hoping to achieve? I told you that's a tricky one, Agnes. Hey, what else? Many of you say 8. Paul says 1, 3, and 8, right? So many of you are saying 8, 3, and 8. Okay. Hey, Pout, good to see you. Is that Pout? I think so. And there's a Helen too. Hey. So these are some popular openings, and people say these things, and our intention is to get to that, what do you call it, effect. But usually what people do is they don't stop there. I'm not going to give you an answer because I don't know. Okay, I don't know the answer, but thank you for guessing. That's fun. And here is a little bit of continuation from that effect, from example number 1 by Peter Szabo. So they speak a little bit about, the client telling them about what they do and all those things. After that, after a little time, Peter says something like this: suppose somehow we manage to get closer, one tiny bit step closer to that goal, and you walk out of this coaching session. How would that make a difference? And the client says, I think I would feel more confident about taking some more risks, of being more assertive, and what I want for the future of my business and the future of my company. Now, what would you say at this point if you are continuing the effect conversation? Here's what Peter does. He picks up on that word assertive, and he doesn't ask, how will you get more assertive? He doesn't say that. He says, okay, as a consequence or as the effect of that assertiveness, what kind of things would I see you do that are, that you're not doing right now? So not only asking about the effect of this conversation, but also as that happens, what is the effect of that is what Peter seems to do here. Let's see if that's kind of true for the second one. Here's a big narrative about the whole beautiful miracle question by Insu, but I actually made the section in the middle a little bit darker, because what it says there is Insu just had a pretty good conversation about what she wants as a result of this, and this is exactly what the client says. She says she wants her children back, and also she wants to be stronger on all these things. And also the problem that's related to the children, related to Daniel, which is like the ex-partner, and anything that's in your life is kind of solved. This is exactly what the client says. And then Insu builds on it. Insu does not build towards it, she builds from it. She doesn't say, how will you get stronger? Or how will you do that? She says, so suppose that. Then what will be the effect of that happening? And when I was first reading, it's like, wow, you just keep going and going and going and into like deeper into the effect of what you wanted to talk about here. And then what's the effect of that? And what's the effect of that? So I was really like, it was very striking to me when I was reading this. And then of course, does Steve do that too? Steve says in the middle of that conversation with a client, one of the questions that Steve asked was, so, what would that look like? What kind of difference would that make in your relationship with your mother? And the client said, maybe if I said good morning to her or hi, something like that in the morning. And Steve says, that will be a surprise to her. Client said, yeah, probably. And then Steve says, okay, and what would she do, you think? How would she react? Now, don't you find it interesting? Because it's not something that the client can like change. Like she cannot change how she will react, but he's asking about it. He says, how would she react? And then client kind of guesses, well, my mom can be pretty over emotional and maybe, this and that, and even cry or, go overboard with it. And then Steve says, somehow overboard. And how would you react to that? So she does this and she goes overboard somehow. How are you going to react to that? So Steve does it in a way that he's asking about what will be the effect of you saying good morning? What would be the effect on her? Well, she will do this. She will be like this. So suppose she does that. What will be the effect on you when she does that? So I found it very interesting when you are actually analyzing transcripts. They don't stop at the first effect. What will tell you that this was useful, but then really go much deeper into the relevant effects that are happening as a result of that. And that they actually spend about anywhere between 60 to 80% of time doing this. So when you actually watch other tapes of coaching from other modalities, rarely you will find that happening, that people are spending so much time in quadrant 1. And that's what was really, really striking. Second F word is the effort. And one of my favorite articles actually by Harry Corman, effort-based, Harry Corman, and is that Scott Miller? I forget. Okay, Jonas, thank you for that nod. That's reassuring. And it's effort-based interviewing. So when you think about the effort, like, how do we do this? Hey, Julia, good to see you. And, how do we have this conversation if we are getting to the effort? What do you mean by effort? Like, what do we do? What does it sound like? So, I don't know if you do this, but as a hobby, I read transcript. That's my bedtime reading. I love it. And it keeps me awake because it's so exciting. So when we look at efforts, a lot of times, especially in coaching literature, for some reason, Paul, you might actually speak to this too. For some reason, people talk about the effort that now you need to make. as a coaching conversation. They say, here's the goal, and now what can you do to get there, as if that's the coaching conversation. And I have a bit of trouble with that. So when I actually look at solution-focused conversations, effort is not necessarily the effort that now I need to make, but it's about the effort that I've already made so far to make the progress that I have made, especially in the context of all the effects, positive effects that the client already talked about. So effort sits in a little bit closer to quadrant 2. But oftentimes what happens is effort is not necessarily, well, so what's been working well, that's great too, but then usually that effort is relevant to the quadrant 1 that they just described. So the mother saying hi, and you doing this, and mother being surprised, and how would you react? And that conversation, effort is related to that. It's not removed from quadrant 1 that we just explored. So second F word is the effort. And some examples, by the way, is that okay that I show you another PowerPoint? Like, is that like boring you to tears? Is that okay? Oh my gosh, thank you. Okay, good. Phew. So here's like, how do we do this in session? How do we discover their efforts? So here's a first example, same session, Peter Szabo. So he says in the middle, he says something like, so if you think of the last couple of days or weeks, what could be like signposts to you, pointing your attention towards how were you moving towards this miracle? So now this effort conversation, is happening after exploring the miracle question. And then the client says, well, a couple of letters that I wrote to people that I've been meaning to write for a long, long time. And that I wrote them and I put them in the mail and I just couldn't wait any longer. At this point, how would you like to respond to this client? In this little blank, what would you like to say? I'm going to give you, a very nice, relevant effort. Thank you for, that compliment. Well, so what difference would that make? Jonas says. So what difference would that make now could actually then, you can see how it may orient, intended orientation is towards quadrant 1, right? So by you asking what difference would that make, or what else? So what else will then ask the client to tell you a few more things about what they have already done, which is Q2, quadrant 2. Amanda says, how did you manage to write those letters? How did you do that? See, what's so interesting is we see this consistency when we look at transcript of specific models like solution-focused models. We notice the consistency among many different practitioners, meaning there's a model that we actually do follow. Some other modalities that we actually look at, especially in the coaching field where things are still a bit unregulated, patterns like this are kind of hard to find, right? So, but then in the CBT, for example, they may have a little bit more patterns, but social focused therapy and practice seems to have much more consistency among practitioners. So as many of you are saying, this is what Peter says. Okay, so my question is, how did you manage to do that? And of course, he asks like 2 more times, like, what else? What else? And it's fascinating to see how the client closely follow our lead. And we're not asking them leading questions, but we're leading them with our questions in terms of their direction and orientation. If we ask them about, so for example, Peter here is asking about quadrant 2, that's intended direction. So if you think of the last couple of days or weeks, and then what does a client do? They answer within that frame. They're like, well, and they give you the answer that's fitting with that assumption. And then Peter then goes to, so how did you manage to do that? So I find that really interesting because that's the effort conversation that Peter is having with this client. Now, how do you go to the next one? So here's Insu's session, continuing from that example that we saw. Now, Insu says P is for practitioner. Some people don't like that term, but I don't know. I'm okay with it. So Insu says, so you will be thinking about what can I do to be a good mother? What can I do to help my kids? That kind of stuff is what Insu asks the client. And this is much later on in the conversation, actually towards the end. And client says, well, I just start all over again. And in bracket is what Insu says in repeating. So start all over, right, she says. And then Insu then takes actual turn and says, so let's tell me more. Give me some idea. So what would you do when you start all over? What will you do? And the client says, well, first of all, now that they know my kids grown up and had been placed in school and something like that, no daycare, take them to places, I'd buy them nice things. Now, this is still kind of in the preferred future. Now, this is what the client says. How would you respond to this client? What would you say? Just take a couple minutes and just put it in the chat box. What would you say? And I see Brian's face. Hey, Brian, good to see you. And Rochelle says, how did you think of doing that? I chose this script because there are like so many scripts to choose from, but I chose them because they're slightly different and they show up kind of differently, but actually this is really getting to the efforts. And that's why I chose these things. And as you are thinking about how you might actually respond to this client, and you don't have all the context because it's a very short excerpt, right? But even given that situation, here is what Insu says next, okay? Right? Paul says, I wonder if you've done some of these. So Insu says, you love your children very much. And the client says, yes, I do. And Insu says, you do. And client says, that's all I got. Insu says, So where did you learn to be such a good mother, good loving mother? Man, that really makes me like tear up. Every single time I see this, I watch the session and this woman who is like pouring out all the struggles and all these things throughout. Insu says, how did you do that? Like 17 times. And then here towards the end, she says, so where did you learn to be such a good mother? Oh my gosh, doesn't that give you like goosebumps? This is so amazing. Anyway, maybe I'm too excited about it. Okay, I'll calm down a little bit. And then now here's an example from Steve DeShazer. Steve says, the client actually says, well, right now I just want to, this is where actually the tape's title comes from. So I just want to, I feel like I have to right now. Steve says, you have to. Yeah, any ideas about what would need to happen for you to move from wanting to actually wanting to? And clients are just feeling more positive about myself. Now, what would you say? How would you respond if you were to go back to this tape, sitting down with this client, fill in the blank? What will be your next response? Not necessarily a question, but what will be your next response to this client? What might you say? I mean, if you have pen and paper, please do that. If you want to put it in the chat box, please do that too. Just feeling more positive of myself, the client says. And this actually is a little bit after all this conversation actually is happening. And Rochelle says, sounds nice. Yeah, sounds nice, doesn't it? Brilliant. Thank you for not asking yet another question, right? Yeah, because it's I mean, really, whenever I read these transcripts, it's surprising how little questions that they actually ask, especially Insu. Like 2/3 of her intervention is formulations and everything else but questioning. So yeah. Martin says, that's a very positive thing already. Who would first notice? Okay. When you feel more positive about yourself, who will notice it? Hey, look at that. What's the first thing that you would notice in your more positive self? So when you're actually posing something like this, always think about, where are you trying to orient the client's attention to? Like, if you know this very simple map of quadrant, is that quadrant 1, 2, 3, or 4? And then oftentimes our clients do follow our assumptions embedded in those questions. And that's the power of questioning, right? Now, here is what Steve actually does. So Steve preserves a lot of that. And he says, so feeling more positive about yourself. And client says, yeah, that's significant because that's what they just calibrated on. Calibration is a term that we use in microanalysis, that we are now on the same common ground, that, Steve's saying, this is what you want. Feeling more positive about yourself. Client says, yeah. And then Steve then adds to it. So when was the most recent time? Maybe have been minutes, hours, within the last few months. You see how many options that, Steve is giving. When you felt just a little bit better about yourself. What do you think? So when the client says, feeling more positive about myself, and then now Steve is asking, when was the most recent time? Maybe minutes, hours, within the last few months. So asking about what we call instances, exceptions, whatever that might be, it's kind of efforts that they are already making. So, by now you're like, yeah, what a great response. But what's so funny is we celebrate, oh, brilliant response. But then when it actually lands in the conversation with our client says this, I don't know if I really have. I can't, I don't know. No answer. So we think we're so clever, but then it's like, I got no answer. Now what? Yes, Paul, you have your hand up. Isn't your hand up? Really?
Yes.
You're kidding.
It is. Can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
So I see very much where you're going with the things we're saying are orienting our clients to one or other quadrant. We're inviting them to pay more attention to certain things or elaborate certain things. And I can see how the Steve DeShazer fits absolutely into that, and Peter's. Insu's, though, seems really different. And
yes.
I agree, it brings a tingle. It's an amazing thing she says. And I'd also say that maybe you couldn't say that to every client in that situation, that there was something that she felt about this woman that she was with, that she would respond to that categorization of her as a loving mother, and with an interest in thinking about how she knew to do those things. So where does that one come from, and to what extent is that one teachable?
Wow, I love that question so much, Paul. When Insu says that, actually it doesn't come out of a vacuum. It's the term that they sort of play with, like from the beginning, actually, about good mother and being that mother, caring. So that is kind of all the way through. But that good mother is something that they both calibrate on right before this conversation. So if you were to take this, where did you learn to be a good mother? You can't really repeat that in this, like another context with another client. I mean, maybe not even with the same client in another context. So that was very much calibrated before. But Paul, I love when you actually say, yes, Steve and Peter, they kind of like, you can really see it clearly. But actually Insu overall, when you look at quadrant, I've done quadrant analysis for actually all 3 sessions. And Insu, when you look at the analysis, she stays a lot in quadrant 3, it seems. But if you look at more analysis of it, the more seasoned you are in practice of solution focus, Steve does this too, they do not shy away from quadrant 3 or 4 at all. They actually repeat that. So in their first part of the response, they don't shoot another question. They usually respond with formulations. Formulations being maybe making a statement based on what they see, what they hear. And usually the statement is around quadrant 3 or 4. I didn't know that until I actually analyzed Insu's session, the particular one that I Love My Kids session. Her, like, I forget what percentage, but majority of her formulation is in quadrant 3. And I thought, Insu, you are preserving a lot from quadrant 3, but she never asks a question about it. She acknowledges it, but she does not explore it. But if she didn't acknowledge it, probably the client will talk more about it. I don't know. But it was really shocking, actually, how much of quadrant 3 and 4 that Steve and Insu, they both preserve in their formulations. They don't necessarily ask about it, but they do let them know that, okay, so this is what's happening. Insu does this, right? Oh, sounds tough. It's tough. And the client says, yeah. And then Insu does a question that is usually orienting to 1 or 2. So magical almost. Thank you for that question, Paul.
Can I respond again?
Yes.
Very briefly, there's a well-known saying, isn't there? 1 foot in acknowledgement, 1 foot in possibilities. And you keep both feet in those places. Yeah. And perhaps here we have an instance where with Insu, she's so strong on acknowledgement that she's given herself that space to make the outrageous compliment to open up.
Yeah, probably. Yeah, and I think, I also thought, what if the client actually said, well, I don't consider myself a good mother.
Yeah, that's the risk.
Right, then what are you going to do? Well, then move on.
Yeah, you can always move on.
Well, it's not calibrated, just move on. But what's interesting is this idea of good mother happened several times before they come to this place. So, when you actually trace this little good mother, the concept of good, caring mother, it happens separately, together, 3-4 times already before they come to this point. It's already calibrated. And I found that example very, very unique. That's why I actually put it in here. Thank you for noticing my effort, Paul. Phew. Okay. So here, for example, the client actually answers, I don't know if I really have. You see, Steve was trying to kind of like, so when was the last time type of stuff. And client says, I don't know if I really have. Seriously, what are you going to do with that? How would you respond to this client at this point? The client says, I don't know if I have. What do you think? And some of you might say, suppose you did know. Oh, man. Please believe the client that they don't know. Oh. Isn't it interesting? So oftentimes solution focused, I think, especially in coaching contexts, is we oversell questions as if it's a question. That's what we do. It's not at all that. Because you ask a good question, what does it even mean? Because you hear the response and clearly this question didn't work. So when you actually listen to, one of the things that Peter DeYoung actually said in one of the, I consider many people in the field my mentors, including Paul. I actually initially started my career in SF with your book. So you didn't know that you're my mentor, but you are. So when I actually watch these sessions, people do a lot of things that are really resetting sometimes when you feel like, okay, I don't know where to go. One of the things that Peter DeYoung said was, in any point of your session, you ask yourself this one question. And the question is, what did I just hear the client say that they want? Now that's like a reset. You can start a new session from that moment on. And that has worked each and every single time for me. Now, Eugenia says, what a close friend of you will tell me. And here is what Steve says. He says, if I were to ask your mother about when she thinks, you maybe felt better about yourself in recent months, any ideas about how she might answer that? So this pursuit of effort, it doesn't have to be just you, your perspective, But surprisingly, this time, same client, one intervention ago, now one intervention later, client says, well, at some point I started reading a book. And there is that effort that he is already making. And that's what I find really persistent about what Steve does, that he doesn't drop that direction. He is very clear about that direction and he pursues that. So those are some examples I can give you from some classic examples, right? So then just another quick observation from other coaching modalities that I Googled. And here are some of the things that I actually found as well. So some responses, I'm going to just, in case you can't see the slide, I'm going to read it to you. So which one do you think is really getting to the effort of the client? Number one, how's everything going so far? Number two, after scaling questions, so how did you manage to get to this point so far? Well, it sounds kind of similar to one, but it's a completely different question. Number three, so you have a clear goal, and what's your next small step that you need to make? Does that sound like an effort to you? Number four, where did you learn to be such a good mother? You just saw that. Number five, who else might have a say in how you've been managing this as well as you have? Number six, what do you need to do to get rid of those barriers? And then number seven, what would it take for you to be successful? So take a guess. Which one do you think is really, in its true sense, like really getting to the effort, not the effort that you now need to make, but effort that you have been making in the desired direction? You see? Interesting, eh? When you actually show this and then ask people who are kind of new to modalities, it's like it's very tricky. But when you look at this, you see how we're very specific about the direction in our questions or in our, I guess, pursuit of their effort. So, hey, that's neat. I noticed that we have a few more minutes left, and it's the last little bit. Just out of curiosity, what do you think is the last F word? The first one is the effect. Second is the effort. The effect that they want to see as a result of coming, effect of that. Effort is the effort that they have made so far in that direction. What do you think is the third F word? Like how many other words that starts with EF, right? I don't know. So, oh, I see Helen. Hi, Helen. My goodness. You need to go to bed, people in like different time zones. Helen, good to see you. Wow, look at that. Jonas says efficient. Thank goodness you say that. Martin says efficacy. Oh, man. Hey, effusion. That's neat. All right, so the word actually is efficacy. Well, it's slightly forced because it's the same thing as effectiveness, right? So when you think about vaccine, what's the efficacy of vaccine and what's the effect of vaccine, you can see a slight difference because they do come from the same root word, effectiveness and efficacy. They come from the same word. But now efficacy is an interesting word. I don't want to get into the whole psychological framing of stuff because I find it a little clunky. But just for our observation, when we talk about efficacy, the way that it can be actually defined as probably, do you believe that you can actually get the result that you want or something like that, very loosely, right? So self-efficacy by Bandura, for example, is something to do with one's perception or their own self-judgment about, can I actually adapt to the situation given my skills and circumstance? That's what it's how it's defined in psychology. But you know what's interesting is yesterday I went to play golf. Instead of actually preparing for the session, I went to play golf with my mom. That's the sports that we both love. But then it's two of us. And for those of you who don't play golf, it's supposed to be like 4 people playing together. So we just go to this public course and they just match you up with anybody. So we went there and then we had another twosome. It was so sweet. It was like a father and a very young daughter. So this young daughter, her name is Lana, fake name. And she says she's 19 and it's during her school holiday. So she's just learning. She was a painful beginner. Like my mom and I, we've been playing for some time. My mom is like, she plays like a pro, right? And I am not bad. And then the father is pretty good too, but then the daughter is like such a beginner. It was so much pain to play with, but you know, the whole solution focus, whatever. So I was like trying to remind myself, okay, be nice. Then there came a place where she needs to now like tee off from this hole where there's right after the hole, there is little water. Like it's a little creek, but it's kind of, you know, so she was worried about it and she was about to tee off. And she turned to her father and she said, I know I'm going to lose the ball. So I'm going to just say goodbye to the ball for now. Okay. And I'm like, okay, don't say anything. And then the father says, Lana, with that like corrective tone, Lana. And he says, think positive. Believe in yourself. And did it help her? No, it didn't. It just twice. She just went into the water. I'm thinking that doesn't help her. She's got no skills to believe in herself. You can't just ask her to believe in herself. So I was kind of like really puzzled as we were walking together. But in the same hole, actually, Lana hit something and she was able to hit the ball in a very nice sounding tap. So she tapped it and it was like surprisingly well done. So I couldn't help myself. So of course I went to her and I said, Lana, how did you do that? So what did you do that was different this time? And she's like, oh, I don't know. I just saw your mom play and your mom seems to swing upward, not sideways like I do. And I said, hey, can you show me? Like, how does my mom do it? And she showed me how my mom does it. And I said, and how do you do it? And she showed me how she does it. And then really from that moment on, her game got better and better. And then the whole time, like her father's like, see, I told you to believe in yourself. You get better. I'm like, oh, come on. It's not because of that. But I didn't tell him. But it was so funny. Efficacy. So when you think about efficacy, self-judgment about your own skills and your ability to be able to cope in different places. But here's my question to you. When we work with our clients in the way that we do, how do we actually work with our clients in a way that increases their sense of own efficacy? Second question to you is our own practice. How do you know that we are getting the result that we say that we do? So for your own practice, what's the efficacy? How do you know? And then also for those of you who are actually teaching the practice, this is the most humbling thing for me. How do you know that your students' progress has anything to do with you? Like they get better and we take all the credit, but seriously, how do you know that it's got anything to do with you? So anyway, that's the third F word. And I just wanted to share that with you because, you know, I really care about making things kind of simpler. And really, it kind of helps me sometimes to sort of ground myself when I actually am teaching, when I'm doing coaching, really thinking about, am I really getting to the effect of why did you come here? What's the purpose of your visit? And what would you see that's, you know, positive effect of you coming? And what's the effect of that? And what are some efforts that you're already making in that direction? And by doing that, I think our clients do feel that they're closer to where they would like to be than they actually walked in. Anyway, hey, thank you for joining. I hope that you had fun. I did, but I hope that you had fun and I hope that was useful for you. And if you want to actually get in touch with me, I think this video will be shared somehow. And so all that stuff, right, Paul? Yeah. Okay. Anyway, that's it. You have questions, let me know. But I mean, really, I hope that this encourages you to look at your own tape, do some recordings and really read it, see it and watch it. And I think that will be fun. Anyway, thank you for joining. You have a wonderful rest of SF24, 21. There you go.